So, what are we going to call this podcast?
Jeez, that's a great question. Let me think about that. I think maybe that through the dialogue we're about to have, maybe we'll come to something.
It's like I keep coming up with these great podcast names, but then I search them and they're already taken. And it's not just like they're already taken, but they're taken by like 6 million people.
Well, all right. I mean, that's probably true, but what about movies? I mean, there aren't original movies anymore, right? So maybe we can just find a really cool podcast from like 20 years ago and we can reuse that name. So it's like retro, it's like a remake now.
Okay, so we're going to call this podcast Jurassic Park.
Okay, that sounds awesome. That's one of my favorite movies. So here we go.
Hello, I am Pepin, and this is Patrick over here, and we're going to have a conversation about conversations, essentially. So Patrick and I, we're friends, used to be coworkers, and then, we broke up from the job. Well, I broke up from the job, and, now we're back together.
We didn't really like it.
Yeah, well, but we had all these weird random discussions at work, and we'd have these discussions between customers, and these discussions were always very philosophical and lengthy, and it's like you don't meet too many people who can have those in-depth philosophical conversations like that.
Yeah, that was probably one of the best parts of working together, to be honest. It certainly wasn't the job, but the conversations were great, so I'm looking forward to having one here today.
Yeah, and so the topic today, and we're going to just go all over the place with this, so don't expect this to be very focused. I mean, Patrick himself is not very focused.
Not at all. And
so the topic today is just going to be conversations in general. And why I bring this up is I think it's a good, starting episode for us to talk about because, number one, what is a conversation? Number two, where are the bounds of conversation? Like, some of the stuff we talked about, at work, was very inappropriate, but at the same time, it wasn't like we were doing it in a way that was, say, malicious or judgmental. And I think sometimes we're just trying out ideas and trying to see if they were, say, applicable to reality or just seeing if they were defensible. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, and actually, it's inquisitive is what it is. I think that's really the word, and I think that's where some people, when you talk about dialogue and having conversations, right? Some people take offense to these topics just automatically. And one thing is, how do you understand why you're offended by it if you don't want to have a discussion about it, right? Mm-hmm. That's the first thing that I think is when you're offended by something, why exactly are you offended? Have you ever noticed that sometimes you ask someone that question and they actually can't answer you?
Mm-hmm. Right, or they're offended even by just the prospect of discussing something.
Right, it's like, how dare you ask me that, right? And it's like, well, I have a right to know why it offends you, because then hopefully I can avoid doing that again in the future. But if we don't have a discussion about it, then to me it's just an arbitrary dismissal of a concept. And we should be inquisitive by nature. That's how we grow as human beings.
Right, and I think some of the more fundamental things that we take for granted need to be questioned, or maybe not questioned is the right term, but we have to find the underlying mechanics of it. So, for instance, we know that murder is wrong, we know that rape is wrong, but just saying that just straight out, like rape is wrong, well, why is it wrong? Like, it's not like by asking that question you're endorsing rape, or you're endorsing anything to do with it, but you can still try to explore what makes us moral, what makes us immoral. And sometimes when you even ask that question, people get offended. Like if you ask the question about, say, whether euthanasia should be allowed or whether abortion should be allowed, maybe you even have the belief that abortion should be, say, allowed, but you're kind of questioning the foundation of that. Does it really make sense fully? You believe it makes sense, but you might ask somebody certain questions about that and challenge them on their beliefs. Maybe challenge isn't really this right word for it, but you can kind of just have a conversation about it, and people get defensive sometimes about that.
I agree. I wouldn't say it's challenge, but I would say it's more like validate their beliefs and validate it through objective criteria, because simply saying, as you said, with something like, let's say we know that rape is wrong or abortion is wrong, right? Just by saying that simply because that's what we've always been told or what we've observed to be true, then at this moment, that is subjective information. And when we're asking the question, why exactly is it offensive to talk about abortion? Or why is it offensive, let's say that you're talking to someone who's pro-life. Mm-hmm. Why is it offensive to take a pro-choice position? Mm-hmm. If we don't have some criteria to evaluate that with, and we're not able to have a discussion about it, then right now it appears to be subjective information. And although to most rational people, they might be able to agree on a position about some topics, there are other topics where I think most rational people would conversely believe that they're inherently subjective. But the problem is that if we don't apply objective criteria across the board and have discussions about why things are moral or immoral, then when we come to these questions of things that to most people are obviously immoral, how can we condemn them? Because already the things that we condemn, we can't defend.
And here's like an interesting point I just thought of. So think about how in the Constitution it said that all men are created equal. And of course, back then when they said that, it was very delimited in what they're trying to mean, because they didn't mean like all people. They didn't mean dependent. They weren't including color into that. All white men are considered equal, not women, not blacks, not Asians. It's this one subject, or this one, say, circle of society. And what people started doing over the time was, say, questioning that statement. Well, if all men are equal, why not these people? What is the foundation that makes all men equal? And there's a lot of philosophy in John Locke and natural rights, and how this kind of gives people their, say, right to freedom of speech, their right to defend themselves, and all these other rights. And people said, well, if this is applicable to this person, who has these properties, why isn't it applicable to these other people? And people had certain rationales for that and explanations, but the continued conversation, even if you at that time didn't fully agree with it, it still furthered the moral question. And eventually we figured out there actually is no reason to differentiate between races or between the sexes as far as, say, natural rights.
That's true, but it's interesting because it's a convenient excuse that we use. Like when you say at the time all men weren't created equal. Well, that's in a way true, but in a way it wasn't, because the way that, for example, African Americans were viewed during slavery was that they were less than human beings. So essentially, if you have, as you mentioned, a circle, right? And we consider this circle to be like the Mandela, that in which we include those who are moral beings in our society. If you take a certain group outside of that circle, then it's now justifiable to do certain things to those people, or to we don't have to justify the same types of things that we would apply to other human beings. This is the same type of thing that happened with the Holocaust, right? That Jews were equivalent to swine. And so whatever you would do to a pig, it's okay to do to a Jew, right? And so we see this constantly. And maybe right now in the United States, we're not seeing something that rises to that level exactly, but you do see a lot of partisanship, and you see that when people can't justify or defend their positions, a lot of times the excuse is used, well, it's because you don't understand this, or because you're part of a certain group, so of course you're going to have that perspective, right? It's a convenient dismissal of dialogue.
It's kind of almost like a magic spell a little bit. Or I think the more accurate way to look at it is it's a short circuit, because what I realize with people is that anything that has a high cognitive load will tend to result in that person avoiding that high cognitive load, and they go to a default answer. So, in instance, with religion is certain people believe that why are there rainbows? Because God made rainbows. Why does it rain? Because God wants it to rain. Those are answers to the question, but really what's happening is the person is assigning this kind of catch-all answer to God, which, if let's say God does exist and he is responsible for this, he's saying ultimate cause for it, but we're looking more for the mechanistic causes. And instead of actually taking on, say, the a more real answer to it, they will short circuit to something which is more of a default answer. Because what I'm really impressed with as far as John Locke and, say, natural rights is there's a very logical foundation as to, say, self-ownership. Man has the ability to choose. Man just meaning, people in general, and more the, old ye sense. And people have this, ability to choose, to gain self-ownership through, say, John Locke would have some other answer for this, but I would say it's these neurological structures that give the ability for people to grant choice and to have, say, higher levels of perception and consciousness. And this creates a state of being where you're able to exercise yourself in a way which is unusual compared to other beings. So like a dog, you could say maybe has some level of consciousness, some level of freedom or autonomy, but not to the same level that a human does. And it's not to say that dogs should be like disparaged in any sort of way, but there's something about the properties of human that give them the ability to have that self-ownership. And the claim that John Locke makes is that self-ownership should be respected. Now the question is, if those properties gives the result of that, and this is what we agree, the reason why we should have rights, or we should have this, these abilities to defend ourselves and everything, then if you find some other entity which has those same properties and those same underlying mechanisms that create the same thing that we conclude create this in us, then that other entity must also have natural rights by extension.
That's a great point. And I just want to circle back for a second to something that you said right towards the beginning with regard to the rainbows. And I want to relate that to another discussion that I've often had with religious individuals. And this is not in any way to disparage people who believe in God or any form of religion. I personally subscribe to Buddhism, and I know plenty of people who are religious. And because I believe in natural rights, I believe everyone has a right to exercise their own beliefs. But that said, evolution is a conversation that I've had frequently with people who believe in God, and not all of them are, but many are dismissive of the idea of evolution, and that humans evolved from apes and various other forms of it. But anyway, who's to say that God didn't create beings who were capable of evolution? Just like when you're saying, all right, did God create rainbows, or did God simply create a situation where rainbows could be constructed? So that's really the question, because if we understand how the rainbow is constructed, if we understand how organisms evolve, it doesn't mean a dismissal of God. It could simply mean that God has created this algorithm that, when properly inputted, can give us these outputs, right? And so by understanding those inputs and outputs, then that gives us an opportunity to learn and to grow. And why that's important is because when humans encounter unknown situations, then do we simply put our faith in it that this situation was presented by God and will therefore work itself out? Or do we try to find the inner mechanism that caused the situation and therefore overcome it and prevent it from happening again?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to give some slight disagreement there with that point. So I think when some people deny evolution in that sort of way, I'm going to use the word deny. Let's say they argue against. That's a more better way to put it, because you're not, say, implying the conclusion in it.
Sure.
So when people argue against evolution, sometimes it's for the reasons you're saying. Like, they don't believe that evolution is compatible with say, Christianity or whatever religion it might be, and there might be some reasons to actually say it's not compatible. Now, the argument you're making is that it is compatible, that there's not necessarily a incompatibility, but if you have a more, say, fundamentalist, literal view of the Bible, let's say the Christian Bible, or even, say, the Torah or the Quran, it is legitimately incompatible in what it's trying to say. Because if you accept, say, the tenets of evolution, then you also accept the tenets of physics in general. And the tenets of physics say that the Earth has been around for, say, millions and millions of years. I think it's like 1.4 billion or something like that. And also that evolution occurred over, say, 500 or so million years. I forget what the exact number is, but it's essentially been happening for a while, where the Bible makes a very factual claim, which is simply incompatible for it. So if you are saying that everything within the Bible is, say, it is truth, then you can't also say that truth is compatible with, say, the truth of science, because those two truths are conflicting. It's, you can't have both, like, logically.
Okay, so yes, I'll agree with that point. And see, this is actually circles back to the original conversation, which is why dialogue is important. Because where I'm not a religious person, then I wouldn't 100% be versed in these aspects of the argument. But at the same time, I don't think that we have to dismiss or sort of invalidate the other perspective. Like even let's say that you take those, let's say you take those claims literally, and you say, all right, so the Earth is 6,000 years old, or however many years old it is. So does that mean that there isn't a possibility that the science is wrong and that maybe some evolution occurred during that time? I mean, I'm not saying that that's something that I believe, but I'm just saying that it's in fact a religious argument that the absence of evidence is not the evidence of absence. And so for that same reason, if somebody said to me that there is a God, I would not say that they were wrong, because I can't prove or disprove that claim. But that said, and sort of shifting gears a little bit here, that actually is the problem with divine command argument, is that whenever you use an argument that involves any type of divine structure, it's very difficult to prove. And if you're talking to somebody that doesn't already subscribe to that belief, then there isn't any objective criteria. Like that criteria might appear to be objective to anybody that subscribes to that theory, but it's not objective to people who don't. And so what we're really talking about here when we're saying the importance of dialogue and what exactly to bring to the table, we're talking about trying to find criteria that we can use to describe any situation.
Right. And something that you brought up that was important there, I mean, not to agree with you here, because I don't want to agree with you at all, but it's like when you have any sort of discussion, for it to be productive, you want there to be some ability to convince the other person of what you're saying. And it's kind of a game, because if you are, say, admitting or you wanting a state where this other person is capable of being convinced, they're not going to play that game unless you yourself is capable of being convinced yourself. You know, it's a two-way street. Now, if it's not a two-way street, that's fine. You can have that sort of conversation, or you can have that kind of like back and forth, but that back and forth is not going to be, I mean, to my opinion, that interesting, because what's going to come down to is I think this, you think that. I mean...
And so then you're going to have American politics. But yeah, anyway, I have to agree with that point. And like, what would have happened for example, if when you had said, well, you can't have both, they're mutually exclusive, right? You can't believe in evolution and also believe in what it says in the Bible at the same time, right? What would happen there if I said, well, actually, I just think you're wrong, and it just ended there, right? What kind of dialogue would that be?
Yeah, it's not very... I mean, as much as conversation is... We're saying conversation is important, but we're also trying to say that there's a lot of conversation which is bad, and dividing the bad conversation is as much saying that you leave it at like a certain proposition or a certain point without any backing for it. And sometimes there might be just that general point there. But it's like, if there's not a willingness to try to convince the other person of that proposition, then that's where it's tough. It's actually somewhat respectable that, let's say someone says that I believe that the Earth is 4,000 years old because it's from the Word of God. And you say, well, how do you know the Word of God is true? And then they start talking about different stories in the Bible and how Jesus did this and this and that, and then he tries to get you to read the Bible. I mean, as much as that's annoying and kind of like misses, you know, it's not going to be convincing to me, at the very least, this person is, they have a point, and this is the backing them up to that point. That's the evidence they're trying to give you. Like, obviously this is true, just read it, come on, give it.
And I think that in that situation, if I was faced with that exact situation, I would probably have to back away from that discussion, and not because I don't want to engage in the dialogue, but because you can tell that at that point it's not going to be constructive, because again, we're not applying objective criteria to it, because I don't subscribe to that religion. And so that doesn't make that person wrong. I don't want to confuse, but I just mean that it's not a productive conversation at that point.
Right. Well, it's like you had a conversation with me a while back about how, not to give too much here, but you had a conversation with a family member, and he is very religious, and
yes.
he knows you're Buddhist, and he said something to the effect of, Jesus died for your sins, and that was like a reason for you to, switch religions to Christianity. And it's like, from your point of view, saying Jesus, you understand like the mythology and everything, and the backing behind that.
Yeah, the basics. Yeah.
But if you were from like this isolated culture and you never heard about Jesus, all that you're hearing is some guy named Jesus died for your sins, whatever your sins mean. Like, what does that mean?
I would
to
be
you?
like, what are my sins?
Yeah.
Oh gosh, am I in trouble?
Who's Jesus? Why is he important? Yeah. Like, and then you can go into the whole Christian mythos and everything. But then, from your perspective, how is this convincing?
Right. It's not, and I think that's really the key point here, because what is the point of dialogue anyway? Like, why talk about it in the first place if we're just not going to agree? And that's why I think I said before, at that point I would probably walk away from the discussion. And because the other side of dialogue is, all right, you want to have a productive dialogue, but what's the point? The point is that at the end we want to gain something from it, right? That's why we do anything. And so what do we have to gain from that situation? We're obviously not going to convince them. And if I'm not looking for some type of religious instruction, if I'm not curious about converting myself, then I don't gain anything from that discussion. So there's no reason to continue it. It's not productive.
Yeah, and also the definition of productivity is kind of interesting, because I think I might take a different view of productive than other people might. So when, let's say a religious activist, is having a discussion with somebody or a dialogue, their discussion of, or their definition of, say, productive is, get this other person to be more one with Christ, or to accept Christ, or to consider Christ. There's some sort of measurement which they're kind of like some aim they're trying to look for. Other people, they're trying to just have a conversation about, say, a dialogue. Now, in those two instances, there is like it's not a hidden agenda, it's a very open agenda, but it's a one-sided agenda, which is fine. I think people can proselytize and everything, and some of that is good. So when people were arguing in slavery, having those dialogues I think were important. Taking the other person, the other side seriously was, part of what caused that to be a thing. But also, I think some people just kind of coming out with the propaganda and just saying, that's racist, racism is bad, all people have rights. Just having that one-sided dialogue was productive for that aim, but it wasn't productive in creating a dialogue. Now, where I'm trying to come to this with myself is that I have a lot of these, philosophical conversations with people, and I try to, have these conversations not because I want to, like, say, convince somebody of a point or anything like that, but I just want to entertain myself. Like, my brain needs intellectual, like, stimulation. This is kind of what makes me not go crazy. Like, if I don't
get like your brain food.
Yeah. If I don't get enough intellectual stimulation, like, I will, I don't want to like start going crazy, but it's a little bit like that. Like, I listen to podcasts in my spare time. I watch like a lot of educational videos. It's just what I do if I'm not talking to somebody. And I have a selfish reason, and it's part of the reason why I'm actually good at dialogue, because I don't really care what the dialogue goes. I just care that it's interesting and it covers something. And where I'm not entertained is where it gets just one-sided, or it's just like, it's like A, proposition A, this is where it ends. And
right, yeah. So I think that we pretty well understand the dialogue aspect when it relates to religion or something that is a belief of a specific group of people. But what happens, so in all the situations we kind of talked about so far, it's just been, all right, a person is telling me this and I don't necessarily believe it, but that's okay. This is a very libertarian sort of way that we've approached this. But what happens when the result of the conversation actually matters? Like, when you're talking about politics, for example, and, if enough people are convinced by this idea, it could actually it could turn into a law, or it could be something that can affect the wide majority of people. That's another dialogue now, because you're not just talking about one person talking to another person and people sharing opinions, but now we're talking about, you mentioned propaganda earlier, and we're talking about people who are idealists and they think that what they're saying is positive. Of course they do, because they're saying it, right? But what happens if you need to convince someone not to believe in this message, or maybe you want them to believe in the message. Like, how do we evaluate these messages?
Well, this is kind of hard to dissect because there's different contexts to where you might be getting these messages. Because if we assume like it's a free society, that's one thing. But if we assume the society has some sort of, say, fascist or, say, issues for free speech, then maybe the question becomes discolored.
That's another thing. Let's just assume it's a free society. Okay. We're in the United States, so let's assume that the context is that we're in the United States and that we have a lot of different ideas that float around in our political sphere, and people feel very strongly about these ideas. So let's say that some people believe this idea because of something subjective. And this goes all the way back to the beginning of our conversation where we said, all right, sometimes when you ask somebody to defend their belief, they actually don't know why. So you might ask somebody, just for example, why do you support Bernie Sanders, right? Well, because of universal health care. And so that seems like a good reason on its face, but then you ask them, all right, well, do you know if universal health care would actually be beneficial to everybody? And do you know what the overall effects of it are? Most people don't. They just know that like people get free healthcare is a right, and there are other taglines. And that's just one example. And I'm not saying I agree or disagree with universal healthcare. I'm just saying that this is one that seems to be popular. And when you approach this topic with someone that believes strongly that it should be or shouldn't be, how do you have this dialogue? Like, what is the criteria that you're going to look for to evaluate if this idea is good for society?
Well, I think rational ideas are better than irrational ones. So, this is getting really dumb here for a second. But let's say that you want to go north, right? And then to go north, you start going south. Obviously, that's not very rational. Let's say that you want to make yourself a burrito, and you pull out some eggs, and you start throwing them against your car. You're not achieving the end of making a burrito. So the first thing you have to establish is that the action that you are taking and the goal you have may or may not be related. Now of course, the thing is, people always make the assertion that X is related to Y. X is a function of Y. But first, you have to establish that X is the function of Y before you get into it. Because you might say that, for instance, we should. And I'm not saying I agree or disagree with this. I have my own opinion, but it might say that we should decriminalize drugs because it will decrease crime. So there is some plausibility of that being the case. Or we should decriminalize drugs because it will reduce single parenthood. That's another claim there. But you're associating this thing over here with this thing over here that actually might not be associated. So the first question is, are these two things actually related? Is there some justification for them being related? And there might be. So for instance, in the case of slavery was a law. That thing was provable. Like, repealing slavery would repeal slavery. Right? Like, it's a one-to-one cause. If you create a law that says puts a tax on X and Y country, that tax will put that penalty there. Now, the effects of that tax, that's where things get ambiguous, because people might say that this tariff might put sanctions against, say, this country, and this country will start behaving because they have to get on our good side. Or you might say this will protect jobs for us. Or you might say that this tariff would have bad results because now the prices on these goods are going to go up. It's going to go up for, say, poor people or just people in general, and it's going to hurt Americans or whatever population it might be. So there is, say, the act, so the proposition, and then there is the outcome. And you have to establish that the act is related to the outcome, number one. So it has to be rational. And I think that's the first thing you have to do in order to, say, make a political point. And, whether something is, how do you say, is reasonable?
Whether it's reasonable. But it'd be interesting, too, to actually look at some of these claims and find out how many of them would fall into the camp of rational. There are plenty of people that I've spoken to, people who support Trump, people who support Bernie, and people who support Yang or anybody else, really. And all these people have different claims, some more rational than others. And so the idea that we can somehow that people are going to do this, that they're going to assign cause and effect, essentially, is not always true. You have some people that think like that and others that don't. So when it comes time to make a decision, we have to have something that we can say as evidence, because rational, ironically, is actually a subjective criteria, because what one person considers rational might not be the same for someone else. Going back to the religion thing, it's like a person who's religious would say that the word of God is rational because, it's what they're supposed to do.
So I'm going to take issue with that. They wouldn't say that the word of God is rational. They'd say it's true. It's like a proposition. It's something that is just taken to, or it's an axiom. It's just taken as, to be true because it is true.
Well, so it's sort of 6 or a half dozen. I agree that perhaps the phrasing is different, but what I'm telling you is that if somebody subscribes to a certain belief and they try to follow it as closely as they can, then what they'd probably tell you is that, quote, it's the right thing to do, right? So it seems reasonable. It seems like a path that would be intrinsically taken by someone who is of this belief. You wouldn't have to tell someone, essentially. It would be the first, it's sort of instinctual thing that they would feel is the right thing to do. Now, not everybody will do that, but I think that an instinctual path like that, you can argue, so it's not rational, but it's the same line of argument.
Well, saying it's the right thing to do is just the same thing as saying God did it, or because God said so, or because I said so, or just because this thing, right? It doesn't get at the heart of the matter. Now, an issue you have is that eventually you can get to a point where essentially your claim is going to be some proposition, right? But the thing is, any proposition is going to have a value statement there. And so the value statement is that this proposition has some sort of, say, impetus in the value structure that we want for society. Because you can propose any sort of, you can have like a high level objective. The high level objective might be to improve the lives of working Americans. Now, what that actually means, it might be a value directive, because you could have a more hedonistic view where Americans should have the ability to do whatever they want, live however they want, eat whatever they want, not exercise if they don't want to, and have no real consequences for their actions. That's a more hedonistic view. The other thing that people might say is that Americans should be, hardworking. They should take care of themselves, have a high degree of health and fitness. And there's another, say, criteria for that same goal. So there's many different goals, and eventually you might get to the point where you have a disagreement in value of that objective. And the other thing is, if you're proposing a policy which might improve one of these objectives, you can disagree about whether you actually would want to do that. For instance, in New Hampshire, it's legal to drive without a seatbelt. So there's actually a lot of people who will do that, and I don't do it myself, but other people do, and I think that's fine. People have the right to choose whether they, want to wear a seatbelt or not. It's a very libertarian point of view. Now, there's other people that would argue on another basis, which is that let's say there's a father who's driving home, or could be a mother, and they don't wear their seatbelt, and then they crash and die. This creates a lot of strife in the family. It creates medical bills. There's a lot of different things that it causes, and it's a whole domino effect. And what their argument might be is that the effects of this being a thing, people not wearing seatbelts, it has such a large negative effect on society, that we shouldn't allow it. It should be banned. Now, my argument, which is more of the libertarian side, is that even at that price of society that there might be, an individual, say, sovereign freedom, their ability to choose and make decisions about their life, overrides that. So there's that cost, but the benefit of it, of having, say, autonomy, is more worth it. The ability for people to, say, make reckless choices is important.
So, from talking to me for quite a while now, that I have long asserted that liberty, autonomy, and freedom are the highest moral responsibilities that we have. So I have to agree from a libertarian standpoint that those are the most important values. And it sort of circles back around, because now we can use those as criteria when we're having dialogue. So if somebody is saying to you, is this a moral claim or not? Or is this something that would improve society? We don't know that. The thing is, we talk a lot about inputs and outputs, and okay, what is the action and what is the expected result? But we don't actually know the result. It may or may not improve. And just as an example, a discussion that we had a long time ago, if you see a couple arguing and maybe getting physical with each other, do you intervene or not? And so
getting physical as in like a fight, essentially.
Yeah,
like
they're
punching
they're
and
fighting.
stuff like that. Okay.
And like maybe one of them seems to be more sort of abusive towards the other one. And so the question is, do you get involved and do you help the person who appears to be being abused, right? And so you think you know the outcome, which is that you're going to stop someone from getting hurt, and that there's supposedly going to be more utility to intervening than not intervening. And I remember disagreeing with you at the time, but you took the position that intervening, we don't know the result. It could be that the two end up turning on you and you get hurt. Mm-hmm. It could be that the person who was attacking stops for now, but then goes back later and kills the person because they're angry. Yeah. Or it could be that everything stays the same and that they just both hate you. Mm. And so because we never know the exact outcome of a situation, I think it's important that we weigh the sort of values that we're applying to the decision. Mm. Because if we apply the right values, then we're more likely to get an outcome that benefits more people, right? And those values are liberty, autonomy, and freedom. Mm. So when we're having a dialogue and we say, why should we have universal health care? Going back to this. It'd be one thing to say, well, because healthcare is a right. Okay, but that's a statement. Why should it be a right? It should be a right because then people can go to the doctor whenever they want. They can choose the doctor they want. They might have to wait, but at least everybody has access to care. That's an actual argument because now you can say people have freedom, they have liberty, they have autonomy in this way. Mm-hmm. But in the current system, you're tied to your employer. A lot of people are tied to their employer when it comes to health insurance, so they don't have autonomy. If they have a family member that relies on their insurance for a condition that they have, they might not have the ability to quit their job, so they've lost some autonomy there, maybe perhaps some happiness, right? So when we make these claims, we can support them with this criteria because it's criteria that ultimately will benefit you no matter what your belief is. Mm-hmm. Circling back to the religious thing, so your right to practice your religion, that's a liberty that you have. So if you make an argument that a certain decision is going to increase the liberty of everyone, then it doesn't matter what you believe, that applies to you, right? So
I think you can get a little bit meta with this, to be honest, because essentially what we're saying is that values are, say, the ultimate determinant of your belief, right? And belief might be a rational belief or maybe irrational belief, but let's say it's a rational belief. But the value that we might be saying or place, like the value that, the criterion that we're kind of looking at, let's say when someone says, because the word of God said so, or because I said so, or because it's a law, or because this reason, right? Because this is an immutable thing. No one should have to go through, say, this experience. That is ultimately a value they're asserting. They're saying that this value of, let's say, the Word of God is such a high value in life, in my perception of things, or just perception in general. They probably gonna try to say it's universal. That this thing is such a high value that this is the immutable point that we can't change. This is the disagreement here. And the thing is, or the issue is, that if you don't have that same belief in that value, if you don't say put that much stake or importance on the Word of God, then that doesn't do anything for you because you don't share the same values.
Exactly. So when you say that is the value, that's divine command. But when you turn around and you say, actually, it's because we want people to feel safe. And we want people to feel respected. We want to show them dignity, right? That might be the exact same thing, but now it's a value that we have in common, even though we don't both believe the same thing, right? So I think that's where I'm going with that, is that a discussion should be guided by the underlying value that is as universal as can possibly be, right? And so that's also how we kind of guide our discussions. I can give you an example, too, of like how you can take this situation with one specific decision, and you can branch it two ways. So, like, let's say with the right to marry, okay, if you're a same-sex couple. If you think that that's immoral and you disagree with it, then it would be hard to sell that on its face of like, all right, well, we don't believe that the religion's true. Or whatever your reason is for believing it, we don't think that that's right. We think you have that wrong. That's a dead argument, right? But when you apply the criteria that we discussed before, then we can say, all right, so you can have your right to practice your religion, and as long as you practice it and you don't like publicly come out and throw stones at us and say that we can't get married, then fine, everybody can coexist, right? Everybody has their autonomy and their liberty. But then you can take that too far and you can say, all right, so anybody can get married, but additionally, now if you are a church, you have to do these ceremonies, right? And so that's where it starts to get gray, because then you're taking away the liberty of religious freedom from one group to grant it to another. And I will say that I'm pro same-sex marriage, so I'm not against it, but what I'm telling you is that there's a difference between granting overall liberty and autonomy and exchanging it between two groups. So when we're evaluating claims, we can, into as much a degree as possible with something like this, try to objectively determine what's the overall benefit versus detriment to society using this criteria.
I think the most important thing, though, is determining what the values are and where maybe there's intersecting values, but where also where they diverge. Going back to the conversation that we had about the couple fighting, I mean, I'll go to another example here as well, where you got where the conversation got super contentious. Not for myself, because for me, it's not like a big deal in my head. Like it's not this whole big moral thing. It's just kind of a conclusion I came to. It's more how my brain works. But when we came to learn of that disagreement in value, that my importance or my value on, say, non-obligation of, say, non-involuntary coercion, which is to say that if you don't see you have no moral impetus to involve yourself in that situation. You could see a drowning man or drowning woman or even a drowning child, and you could choose not to save that entity because there is no moral obligation on yourself. That is my ultimate kind of value there, because you might be a little bit libertarian, but I'm like full libertarian. I'm full gung-ho with that sort of stuff. And now that disagreement in values was important, but when we're having a conversation, you kept on trying to convince me or demonstrate a way that this wasn't right, but I kept coming up to the same value because this is actually what I value. So there's a disagreement in values, and that disagreement has a real world impetus for it, right? Or like a real conflict there. But the fact that we found that point of contention and realized I have this belief, you have that belief, it stopped us from having a lot of headache with just arguing these random facts, because you accepted, or you probably still don't accept it, but you accepted that I have this belief, I accept you have this belief, and this is where our points differ. And from my point of view, that's fine.
Yeah. So I mean, I still don't accept it, but
yeah.
I'm just telling you that. So to kind of sum that up here, I think that we can use dialogue to sort of chip away at these differences, and also it helps us understand ourselves a little bit more, because it's a good point that we reached that point of contention where both of us kind of realized, well, actually more so I realized, that there was only a certain degree that we were going to agree on this issue. And it's okay right now. And I will say that, just for argument's sake, the reason I still don't agree is because I think that if you were the person drowning, that it would not be good for you. But I will say that on a libertarian note, I agree that you don't have a moral obligation to help the person. But is it morally irresponsible? Probably. Because if you see a situation where the likely outcome brings more utility than what brings detriment, then again, that goes back to what I was saying before, is why would you have a law that negatively impacts more people than it positively impacts, right? And so and I personally think that's the role of the government anyways, to protect individual freedom and autonomy. So laws should always be about maximizing those things. But similarly, individual decisions should be about maximizing benefit versus loss. And so you'd never know the outcome. And yes, there's a chance if you jumped in to save that drowning person that you might drown. Mm-hmm. So yes, you don't have an obligation. I agree with that statement. But I still think that you have a responsibility, if you recognize that there is opportunity for a positive moral outcome, that you take some kind of action. But if you didn't take action, would I think you were a terrible person? No.
I mean, I might think I'm a terrible person, but I would also say that I didn't have any more, like, I would not have, in an ethical system, I don't think there'd be any moral recourse for myself, or any, say, legal recourse. So, I couldn't be sued or taken to court for not acting. Now,
right, that's true.
People could shame me. And this is, I really like the discussion that we had. That, we'll have to rehash that conversation sometime.
Yeah.
But I really enjoyed the discussion. Now, you were getting pretty mad during that discussion, and I was just kind of like, cool as a cucumber. Yeah. But then what happened later is we kind of got back into a little bit towards the end of the day at work, and then one of our colleagues overheard part of this discussion, and she got in on it, and I got super pissed because, number one, she didn't give me any chance to speak. Number two, this is what she said. I'm gonna do my impression here. Nate, what? Nate, there's a law. There's a reason why there's a law. There's a law against this. But if you don't do this, you're gonna go to jail. There's a reason why they put this into effect. It's like, okay, there's a law against it. There was a law, permitting slavery. Who cares?
Yeah. Exactly. It's actually arbitrary.
It's like we're arguing about whether it should be a law or shouldn't be a law, right? Or whether it should be morally, condemned or not condemned. That's what we're arguing about.
And laws have nothing to do with morality. I mean, laws are constructs that are made to keep society organized, but they have nothing to do with whether something is moral or immoral.
And also, if you say it's a law, it's like, okay, we'll never, propose anything to be a law again, because if it's a law, the laws we have are good enough. They're just there.
Yeah.
We'll just accept them. Never change anything. Never repeal anything. Never put anything else into effect. See, this is where I'm getting worked up, because the argument she had essentially was, because God said so. Right, it's the word of God.
Right, it's the same thing, except it's with laws. Yeah.
And where I got kind of annoyed was there wasn't actually an opportunity for discussion, and it was just more shutting me out and making me feel stupid.
That's what a lot of it is, though. I think that's why we decided to talk about this today, because that's so many people that you encounter, especially, I feel like as time goes on, we're just getting more and more polarized in this country. And so a lot of times when you bring something up to somebody, they can't even be reasoned with. Do you remember that day that there was a certain customer that came in to where we work, and he was talking to me about Trump? Mm-hmm. And he absolutely could not be reasoned with. And I wasn't even disagreeing with him, was the funny part, is that I was trying to, he was talking about China, and whether it was, and the fact that it was amazing that we were doing this stuff with China. And I was actually agreeing with him, but I was trying to explain to him what was actually happening, because the way he was describing it was wrong. Mm-hmm. And so at first I thought it was banter, but then he started to argue with me and say, no, that's not what happened. Mm-hmm. And it's like, he didn't even recognize that we were talking about the same thing, because he was so ready for me to disagree with him.
Yeah. It kind of goes to propaganda as well, because people have like the propaganda or like the talking points, and they have a hard time discussing anything about the talking points. And okay, we're gonna wrap up here pretty soon, because we're going kind of long on conversations. But one that I had earlier, which is that propaganda is dangerous, because you might think it's justifiable in its use, especially if it's for a good cause, say ending slavery, let's say ending child labor, and ending these different things, which you would maybe assume or assert to be a moral good, and maybe they actually are a moral good. Maybe it's completely true. Like in the case of slavery, it's certainly true. Or let's say ending, say, sexual abuse. That's certainly something we should argue for. But the problem is, if you assert a certain modicum of propaganda to that end, if there's an opposing side, and that opposing side is somewhat numerous in, say, number, then what are they going to do? I mean, they don't have a good rational position, right? How are they going to support themselves? By propaganda. So then you get propaganda gets propaganda, and essentially who has the last propaganda is going to be maybe not the winner in the long run, but it's going to muddy up the waters, because essentially you have this propagandistic side A versus propagandistic. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. You're just saying that it becomes a war of smears on both sides, and taking things out of context, and just essentially what do they call that? Cherry picking, mm-hmm. Taking the things that make your side look the best and the other side look the worst, and highlighting those things.
Yeah, or just like catch lines and phrases and stuff like this. Like I got really kind of annoyed back in the day because like Barack Obama had the whole like Obamacare thing, and people got mad about that, saying it's called whatever the law was actually called, but it said that Obamacare is a smear, and then Obama came up with this like statement that said, "Oh, I don't have a problem with calling Obamacare because Obama cares," and everyone's like, "Oh, he got them." And it's like he just made like a little catchy catchphrase. Who cares? Who cares?
I mean, you could argue in a way that that's better than the reverse propaganda. I mean, he sort of disarmed it there.
It's true, but then the problem I'm having is there any like my brain's more conceptual. Like what you call something doesn't matter that much. It's what that thing contains, like conceptually, is what matters.
But it was like in that case, I think the point is that it got people to stop saying it, or at least it stopped becoming such a point of contention. And I think that's a strategy that's used a lot in management. And it actually drives me nuts because I'm a cynic by nature. Mm-hmm. But people who do this, you say something to them, or you complain, you try to disparage the company or talk about how everything's crappy, whatever, and they immediately disarm you by saying something positive or by making a joke. And so you could continue to complain, but then you're just going to look petty, right? Because they disarmed you. And so maybe that's the real answer when it comes to propaganda. Is you don't want to empower it, but you also don't want to try to like argue with it.
I mean, in that case, you laid out. A lot of times, it's not even disarming. I mean, I guess it's disarming, like technically, but it's not like you're like, oh, I feel a lot better. It's more like the subtext there is stop talking about this thing.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not as powerful after. Is all. It's almost like when you're going to get bullied for something, and so you just make fun of yourself first. It's like, are you still going to get bullied? Probably, but at the same time, it lost some of its strength now.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, so this is going to wrap up this first conversation, and why I wanted to have the conversation about conversation is number one, to be meta, but number two, because I think this episode is relatively tame. There's not too much contentious stuff there. A lot of it's just kind of like, the banter everyone does about, say, free speech and, dialogue and conversation. But they didn't go pretty in depth into it. But This is mostly to say that, further conversations are going to be a lot less palatable. They might be contentious. They might say things which might offend. They might say things which have things you disagree with. And disagreement is great. It's good. And the point of this podcast is not so that you agree with us, it's so that you can partake in a dialogue with us, and so that we can have dialogue with each other as well. And there's a lot of chances that we might be trying out ideas, or we might be wrong about something, or we might just be exploring some aspect to something which doesn't need to be questioned, but we still want to explore the underlying mechanisms or why something is wrong. Like, obviously rape is wrong, but it's important to know why rape is wrong, because if you don't know why it's wrong, then you're kind of just like just blindly following that commandment for no reason. And I think it's important to know why. At least that's my value. It's important to know why you act in a certain way, as opposed to just having that tenet as like immutable.
Yeah, I agree. I think I've learned as much from our disagreements as our agreements, and just talking about it, I mean, it solidifies some of my views, but then at the same time, I've changed a lot of them. So, I appreciate you doing this with me, and cool. I look forward to doing it again.
All right, and if you want to catch us out on YouTube, just subscribe. Keep subscribing, hit the notification bell, or, we're probably going to be on some podcast site. I don't know. Like, we don't even know what it's called yet. Let's call it, like, two white guys smoking joints.
Something tells me that'll offend someone, but,
Okay, two white guys smoking blunts.
Okay.
Is that better?
Yeah, much better.
All right.
All right. Thanks again.
All right, check you guys out.